I have sat in courtrooms for the better part of 40 years. I have watched barristers perform and defendants crumble and juries hold their breath at the precise moment the scales tip. I know what a room looks like when it changes, when the thing everyone assumed turns out to be the one thing that was wrong. I have seen it happen slowly, over days of evidence, and I have seen it happen in a single sentence. I had never, until the evening of the 14th of March, seen it happen in a single note. The occasion was the 40th anniversary dinner of Coombe Industrial Holdings, held at the Harborne Club on Alderton's Regent Street. A room of dark paneling and portraits and the particular smell of beeswax and old money that private members' clubs have cultivated for centuries. 60 guests, black tie, a long table set with silver and candles, a string quartet in the far corner playing something nobody was listening to. I was there as the guest of Gerald Whitmore, who had been Reginald Coombe's founding partner in the early years before a disagreement over acquisition strategy had parted them amicably enough to share a dinner table every 5 years. Gerald was 81 and needed a driver. I had been his JP on 2 planning tribunals and his friend for 15 years, and I was glad to come. I had expected a good claret and a reasonable beef Wellington. I had not expected the evening to be the one I would spend the rest of my life trying to describe. Reginald Coombe I knew by reputation, a self-made man of 68 who had built a sheet metal fabrication business into a national supplier, and who wore his success the way some men wear a watch that is slightly too large for their wrist. He moved through the room with the rolling confidence of someone accustomed to being the biggest thing in any space he entered. His speeches were known to run long. His laughter was known to run loud. By the time the first course had been cleared, I had him entirely mapped, which is the habit of a man who spent 40 years assessing credibility from a bench. The young woman I noticed later. She was standing near the back wall of the room, just to the left of the grand piano, a Steinway concert model that sat, rather magnificent and entirely ignored, in the alcove beside the service door. She was perhaps 25, in dark trousers and a plain white shirt, not dressed for the dinner but clearly not a member of the club's serving staff either. Gerald told me she was the on-call driver for one of the regional directors, a young woman from Finch's garage on the Barton Road, come to take him home at 10 o'clock. She had been given the option to wait in the lobby and had apparently preferred the room. She was watching the Steinway. Not in the way people look at furniture they admire, but in the way you look at something you know, quietly, without display, the way you might look at a particular stretch of road you have driven 1,000 times. Her hands were at her sides. She was very still. Reginald Coombe noticed her at the same moment I did, though he noticed her differently. I was aware of her stillness. He was aware of her position, a young woman in working clothes, standing at his event, near his piano, looking as though she had no business being in either place. "You there?" His voice carried easily across the room. The string quartet trailed off. The driver. "Are you admiring my piano?" Heads turned. The young woman looked at him without flinching. "It's a fine instrument," she said. Her voice was level and unhurried, the accent local. Coombe smiled, the broad, indulgent smile of a man who has just spotted a diversion. He set down his glass and opened his arms to include the room. "Well then. Since you seem so taken with it, if you can play that, girl, I'll double your wages for a year. A beat. Something simple. Don't tax yourself." The room laughed. Not unkindly, most of it, the laughter of people who have had their wine and are glad of a small entertainment in the gap between courses. A few of the younger guests exchanged glances. Gerald, beside me, said nothing. The young woman looked at the piano. Then she looked back at Coombe. "All right," she said. Coombe blinked. The laughter thinned. He had expected a red face, a shake of the head, a mumbled no. He had not expected all right. She set her jacket on the service trolley beside the door, crossed the room without hurrying, and sat down at the Steinway. For a moment she simply sat there, her hands in her lap. Then she reached forward and adjusted the bench, not fumbling with it, not looking for the mechanism, but turning the knob with the easy precision of someone who has done it 10,000 times and knows exactly what they need. The room was quiet now, but it was the quiet of polite attention, the held breath moment before the expected awkwardness. People had turned in their chairs. Coombe was still standing, still smiling, his arms folded, waiting for the small comedy of it. She placed her hands on the keys. The first notes of the Pathetique were not loud. Beethoven did not write the opening of that sonata to announce itself, he wrote it to reach into the chest and take hold of something before you have the chance to object. The grave, those slow and weighted opening chords, moved through the room like a change in air pressure. I felt it before I understood it. I saw, around me, the precise moment when other people felt it too, the slight straightening in chairs, the setting down of glasses, the turning away from one another to face forward. The laughter had gone so completely that I could not imagine where it had been. Then the allegro came, and the room simply stopped. I am not a musical man. I have attended concerts with my wife and I have enjoyed them, and I have attended concerts alone since her death and found them too quiet in the wrong ways. I could not have named the key or counted the measures or told you anything about technique. What I could tell you, because I have spent a working life reading the temperature of rooms, is what was happening to the 60 people sitting in that paneled dining hall as the music came. They were not being entertained. They were being opened. The girl played with her eyes forward and her face composed, without theatrics, without visible effort. Her hands moved across the keys with the certainty of long practice and the authority of something beyond practice, a quality I have seen in perhaps a dozen people over a career, the quality of someone who is not performing but simply telling the truth by the only means available to them. I watched her hands. I watched the room. I tried to decide which was more astonishing. The allegro resolved and she moved into the second movement, and that was when I saw Gerald Whitmore press the heel of his hand to his eye. The Adagio Cantabile. I did not know its name until I looked it up, weeks later. What I knew, sitting in that room, was that the melody that came from the Steinway was the saddest and most complete thing I had ever heard in a dining room or anywhere else, a long, unhurried singing line that seemed to say everything about beauty and loss and the gap between them in one breath, and then say it again, and again, with more tenderness each time. I became aware that the woman 2 seats to my left was weeping. I became aware that I was holding very still, as though any movement might break something. I have been in rooms where evidence has moved people unexpectedly. I have watched jurors who began a trial with folded arms and finished it with wet eyes. But this was not evidence, and we were not a jury, and we had been given no preparation. 60 strangers in black tie, and the Adagio came and undid us quietly, one by one, the way the tide comes in. She played through to the rondo, the third movement, lighter in its way, more urgent, a kind of gathering up of the grief and carrying it forward into something that was not quite resolution but was something better than defeat. I found that I had gripped the tablecloth without meaning to. I released it. Gerald had removed his glasses and was holding them in both hands in his lap. Across the table, the managing director of the Northern Division was looking at the ceiling with the focused expression of a man who has decided he will absolutely not cry at his employer's anniversary dinner. Then the last chord. It did not crash or announce itself. It simply finished. The music arrived at its end the way a long sentence arrives at a period, complete and necessary, and the Steinway fell silent. For a moment nobody moved. I have heard the expression about rooms holding their breath and I have always considered it imprecise. What happened in the Harborne Club dining room was not a breath held but a breath entirely forgotten. 60 people who had all, at the same moment, ceased to be aware of their own bodies, sitting in the particular stillness that follows something you did not know you needed and cannot now imagine not having heard. It was Gerald who stood first, and he was 81 years old and moved slowly, but he was on his feet with his hands together before the rest of us had found ourselves. Then the room came up, not in the rushing surge of a crowd that has been waiting to cheer, but in the gradual, unsteady rising of people who are not entirely certain their legs will work, who are standing because there is nothing else adequate to do. A standing ovation, yes, but not the kind with noise in it at first, the kind where the standing is the point, where the being on your feet is the only language available. The applause came after. It filled the room properly then, warm and long, and one of the women near the window was still wiping her eyes and not attempting to conceal it. I noticed, in the far corner, a white-haired man who had not stood with the rest of us. He was perhaps 75, with the upright posture and the particular stillness of someone whose whole life has been organized around listening. He waited until the applause had thinned and then he rose from his chair and he walked to the piano and he bowed, not to the room, not to Coombe, but to the young woman and to the instrument she had played. A single, full, formal bow. I learned later, from the club's secretary, that his name was Philip Ardmore, and that he had given his last public recital at the Alderton Concert Hall in 1998. She stood from the bench. She picked up nothing, did nothing, only stood, and the room, which had been applauding, went quiet again because the standing was over and the standing had been everything. Then she crossed to the service trolley and lifted her jacket from it and put it on, unhurried, as though she were simply preparing to go out into an ordinary evening. Reginald Coombe was, by then, on his feet. He was the last one up. I had been watching him. I had watched the smile leave his face in the first 30 seconds of the grave, and I had watched him lower himself back into his chair during the adagio, and I had watched him press his mouth into a flat line with the expression of a man who has discovered, too late, that he has said something he cannot unsay in front of people he cannot afford to embarrass. He was standing now and he was clapping, but there was nothing of the performance left in him. The ampleness was gone. He was simply a 68-year-old man in an expensive suit, applauding something he had not understood he was inviting. He never did say anything to her. Not that evening. I waited to see if he would cross the room, and he did not. She did not wait for him to. She buttoned her jacket, exchanged a word with Gerald, who held her hand in both of his for a moment and spoke quietly, and she nodded, and then she walked to the door and left to bring the car round, because it was nearly 10 o'clock. I sat down again. The conversation in the room resumed around me, subdued and gentle, the way conversation resumes after something real has happened. Philip Ardmore had returned to his corner and was sitting with his eyes closed, still listening to something that had already ended. Gerald leaned across to me. Her father was Edward Finch, he said. He had the garage on the Barton Road for 30 years. Taught himself piano from library books and records. Died 2 winters ago. He paused. She was his student from the age of 8. A battered upright in the office behind the workshop. He told me once it was the only time the place was quiet. I thought about that. A garage on the Barton Road. An upright piano in a workshop office. A father who taught himself from library books, and taught his daughter in the hours when the tools were put down and the only sound was the music and the rain on the corrugated roof. I have sat in courtrooms for the better part of 40 years. I know what it is to watch the evidence rearrange everything that was assumed. I know the particular quality of a room after the thing that changes it has been said, the way the air settles differently, the way people avoid each other's eyes for a moment, not from shame but from the effort of revision. What I had not known, until that evening, was how much a room could revise itself in 3 movements of Beethoven. How much a dare, thrown across a dining room for the amusement of 60 people in black tie, could return to its maker carrying everything he had not intended to say. He had asked for something simple. She had given him the truth. And the truth, it turned out, was the one thing in that room that was absolutely beyond his means.